I never expected that a dusty cardboard box hidden behind rusted paint cans and broken ladders would bring my whole life gently shaking into motion, especially at my age, when most days are meant for quiet routines and soft memories rather than unexpected truths. And I still remember how I stood there in the dim basement light with aching knees and slow breath, holding that cracked lid in my hands while feeling a strange heaviness settle into my chest before I even knew why. Because something about the faded writing on the side, just two faint initials and the year 1937, felt like a whisper rising from the past, calling my name in a voice I almost recognized but couldn't quite place. I had only gone downstairs that morning because the old heater had started rattling again, and I was looking for a spare filter, wearing my slippers and carrying a small flashlight since the light bulb over the stairs flickered on and off like a tired eyelid. And when I noticed the box pushed far back behind an old trunk draped in a sheet, I nearly ignored it the way I had ignored countless forgotten items over the years. Yet something gentle but persistent tugged at me until curiosity slowly outweighed caution. I shuffled forward and pulled it closer, brushing spiderwebs from its corners and dust from its surface, thinking it was probably nothing more than outdated records or broken ornaments that I'd never bothered sorting through after my husband passed. But the moment I set it on the floor and lifted the lid halfway open, the air seemed to change, almost thickening around me as old paper smells drifted upward, mingled with a faint sweetness like dried flowers long since gone. Inside were carefully bundled envelopes tied with fading blue ribbon, black and white photographs curled at the edges, several small notebooks written in neat flowing script, and at the bottom, folded yellow documents stamped with names I did not know yet felt emotionally close to, and I could sense instantly that this was not just a forgotten storage box. It was a container for someone else's life, a life somehow tethered to mine in ways that felt unsettling, even before understanding why. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the first photograph, showing a young woman standing in front of our very house, though it looked newer then, with her hair pinned beneath a soft hat and eyes filled with cautious hope, and my breath caught when I realized I had no memory of anyone fitting her faith among the stories my parents ever told me growing up, even though her posture and smile mimicked expressions I had seen every day in mirrors and family albums, making me uncomfortably aware of an emotional resemblance too close to ignore. I sat down on the basement steps right there, heart beating heavier than usual, because the longer I stared, the more that girl felt achingly familiar, as though she were family, but not any family history I had ever been taught to claim. The letters unfolded slowly beneath unsteady fingers, revealing soft expressions of longing written to someone called Eleanor, a name that stirred nothing consciously yet made my chest tighten uncontrollably, describing separation, difficult choices, fear of judgment, and promises of reunion that clearly never came. And as I read line after careful line in the dim light, tears formed quietly without asking permission, because grief has a way of recognizing truths we haven't yet reasoned through. Each envelope's date drifted through the late 1930s into the early 1940s, stories of hardship during war years intermixed with hopeful declarations of love, references to a child hidden for safety, and hints of sacrifices that felt too heavy for the paper meant to contain them, until I found a folded page labeled simply, "For the one who will ask one day," and the words inside trembled in my mind before I fully processed them, because it spoke directly to a future voice, someone expected to someday uncover these truths, whoever they might be, told with tenderness and sorrow that a child born under secrecy deserved love unconfined by fear or shame, even if that love could only be expressed from afar through carefully preserved memories. I felt suddenly cold all over, wrapping my cardigan tighter as tears slid down my cheeks, because it dawned on me faintly yet undeniably that this hidden story might somehow belong to me. The timing fit too well when paired with my own mysterious birthplace circumstances, a subject my parents had always answered vaguely but gently, saying only that circumstances had been complicated, and they were grateful to welcome me when they did, words I had accepted unquestioningly until now, never realizing how many details conveniently remained unspoken behind those simple assurances. For as long as I could remember, I'd known only the story of my adoptive parents, who loved me deeply and gave me safety, warmth, and a childhood full of songs and scraped knees and bedtime prayers, never once letting me feel unwanted. Yet suddenly I sat holding evidence of another woman, one perhaps forced to release her baby under painful necessity rather than choice, whose emotions now seemed to echo through decades right into my trembling hands. I feared drawing conclusions prematurely, yet the emotional gravity pulled insistently toward a truth I sensed would not be easily softened, especially with reflections of that young woman still burning behind my eyes each time I blinked. More letters revealed references to married relatives who disapproved of the situation, mentions of train rides and hidden boarding arrangements, whispered desperation that the child might someday wonder why she was kept from knowing her origins, and repeated insistence that love endured even when separation became final, creating a painful mosaic of sacrifice that made my chest feel too small to contain the emotions swelling inside. At one point, I found a pink envelope addressed in careful script simply to "My Darling Girl," containing a single-pressed daisy flattened thinly against the page and a note promising that truth would wait patiently even if decades passed before discovery. And at those words, I wept openly for reasons beyond understanding, because some part of me seemed already to recognize that this message was meant for me all along, preserved like a time capsule until emotional readiness aligned with quiet chance. Sitting in that basement surrounded by dust and old echoes, I felt as though my whole life story had suddenly widened beyond familiar lines, as if inherited roots now stretched deeper into soil I had never explored. And instead of fear, I felt something like aching wonder, mirrored with longing to know more about the woman whose face looked so like mine and who had waited silently within the fragile walls of memory. I rose slowly, clutching the box to my chest like a fragile child as I climbed the creaking stairs, knowing with sudden clarity that everything I thought I understood about my beginnings might soon need re-examination, and that while answers promised comfort, they also whispered of grief waiting to be honored, because the heart always carries multiple histories at once, some chosen and others simply discovered. Carrying that box upstairs felt like carrying a fragile piece of time itself, the corners digging gently into my forearms as though reminding me that whatever truths waited inside were not meant to be rushed but treated with the soft patience my years had taught me. And as I settled at the small kitchen table beneath the humming ceiling fan, sunlight streaming across the worn wood grain where my children once spilled cereal and colored pictures, I carefully spread each photograph and letter into neat rows, feeling like a quiet archivist of my own unknown beginnings, studying faces, signatures, dates, and small moments frozen on curling paper with an urgency that pulsed quietly behind my calm exterior. I brewed a cup of tea, only to forget it entirely as I compared likenesses between the young woman's cheeks and mine, her soft, rounding chin and gentle, upturned brows eerily mirroring family features I'd long attributed to my adoptive father's side, yet now questioned deeply. And the ache grew stronger with every observation because this resemblance was not coincidence. It felt like inheritance whispering across generations. Several letters were signed with the same looping E, clearly written by the recipient, Eleanor, discussing her attempts to find stability, offering reassurance that the separation had been necessary, and expressing ongoing devotion to a woman called Margaret, the writer of most of the notes, and together their exchanged words revealed a bond far deeper than casual friendship, suggesting two young women navigating intense love during a time when social judgment made honesty dangerous. And as their voices formed silent conversations between brittle pages, I sensed how carefully guarded their affection must have been, how lonely their sacrifices became, and how much of my existence was quietly born of that bravery. The child mentioned repeatedly in the correspondence, never named directly, was described with tender phrases about sleeping softly, holding tiny fists near her chest and possessing a curious calm gaze, all details that sent cold recognition through me because my parents had once told me I was an unusually quiet and observant baby who rarely cried. A simple coincidence, perhaps, yet suddenly steeped in emotional significance. One notebook detailed Margaret's fears exposing their situation to her strict parents, her heartbreak at choosing safety for the baby over remaining present, and the sorrowful hope that adulthood might grant the child freedom to reclaim both truth and identity. And reading these confessions left me stunned by the quiet courage behind the simple choices that built or dismantled entire lives without ever announcing themselves publicly. As I absorbed page after page, my emotions shifted from shock toward a softened grief akin to mourning someone I had unknowingly loved my whole lifetime, because looking back, my upbringing had been steady and cherished, yet suddenly felt layered atop unseen sacrifices made by strangers who felt like family now. Each memory of childhood innocence complicated, but also enriched by the realization that deep love had surrounded me long before I could even form words. My hands shook when I finally unfolded the official documents at the box's base, a thin stack of adoption placement records bearing date stamps matching my birth month and identifying only minimal names blacked out, except for one softly written witness signature. Margaret Ellis, and something in my chest opened painfully wide at seeing her name anchored to the bureaucratic reality of my life, bridging imagination and proof into undeniable truth. For long moments, I simply stared at the ink until tears blurred its letters, breathing slowly as I tried to reconcile the comfort of knowing with the ache of late discovery, wondering how many times Margaret might have wondered whether I was safe or loved without ever knowing her wish came true beyond measure. I felt an odd pull then toward the idea of learning more, of searching census records or DNA pathways to possibly reconnect with distant threads, but hesitation lingered too because uprooting emotional beginnings held risks I wasn't certain I wanted to navigate after living peacefully for so many decades without these answers. But something deeper than caution urged me forward, not out of restlessness, but respect for those women whose bravery shaped my existence, and respect for myself as a person deserving the full story of where I came from, even if it stirred sorrow alongside revelation. I gathered the letters carefully back into the box, pressing each ribbon bow flat, knowing I wasn't finished yet, only standing at the threshold of discovery's doorway. And I whispered quietly into the empty kitchen, "Thank you," not directed at anyone living, but offered to the shadows of the past that had stepped forward at last to be seen. In those moments, I felt both younger and older at the same time, younger with newfound curiosity stirring fresh chapters, and older with gratitude for the loving childhood that had shielded me long enough to meet this truth now with maturity rather than confusion, realizing that some revelations arrive not when we are ready, but when we are capable of honoring them.
I sat until the afternoon sun drifted toward evening, understanding that what began with the simple opening of a forgotten box had quietly rearranged the foundation upon which my identity rested, and while unanswered questions remained, what mattered most had been made clear already. My life had always been born from love, even when that love unfolded behind closed doors, whispered instead of declared, carried quietly across decades until an old woman finally found the courage and the paper path to listen.
After I closed the lid on that old storage box, its quiet weight seemed to follow me through the hours that came next, settling into my thoughts as if an invisible presence walked beside me through the familiar rooms of my home. And I began revisiting memories I had long believed fully understood, letting them replay slowly with gentle questions now woven into every scene. Starting with my earliest recollection of safety, sitting on the kitchen floor of our modest house, watching my adoptive mother knead bread dough while humming old radio tunes, the rhythm of her hands steady and secure, her eyes kind and watchful, and realizing I had never once doubted that I belonged there, even though no one ever spoke openly of adoption until I was old enough to ask directly. My parents had told me the truth gently when I was 8, sitting together on the modest sofa, using careful words to explain I was chosen rather than born to them. And though childlike confusion touched me in that moment, it never planted pain because their love felt constant, dependable, unwavering, the kind of affection that fills spaces no questions could shake. Still, they shared little about my origins, beyond assuring me I came into their lives through private arrangements meant to protect both mother and child, details I accepted without challenge for decades because I never felt something missing, as many stories describe. It wasn't absence I carried, but fullness. A home filled with warmth, routine dinners, laughter around board games, school encouragement, scraped knee comfort, and birthday traditions. So the curiosity other adoptees voiced never quite took root inside me until now, when the box quietly revived what I had never intentionally buried because it had never truly surfaced before. I thought often of my adoptive father, long since gone, a hard-working man whose worn hands always found 9 in moments of uncertainty, whose gentle insistence that I could be anybody if I just stayed kind to people shaped much of how I lived my adult life. And remembering him now made me feel tender gratitude that he raised me without ever allowing biology to overshadow belonging, offering unconditional care that became the backbone of my emotional resilience as everything else unfolded. As days passed after the discovery, I noticed how ordinary routines became reflective rituals. I watered houseplants more slowly, lingered over photographs hanging in hallways, studied faces of relatives who shaped me by choice rather than blood, recognizing how family is often defined more by who stays present than who shares genetic ties. Yet alongside that gratitude grew a quiet longing, not to replace what I had, but to understand how the unseen path of others had folded into the life I built. Because until now, Eleanor and Margaret had lived only as names on paper, and the unnamed baby had been just a story written between lines until I claimed her identity as my own. I found myself replaying childhood moments differently, like standing across the street watching neighborhood children with siblings squabbling and reconciling, while I remained an only child who wondered briefly if someone might exist elsewhere who shared my traits or memories, and how I brushed that thought away each time because longing never had room to grow beside the rich experiences my parents cultivated so thoughtfully. But now those small moments resurfaced, not in regret but curiosity, wondering if that young woman in the photographs, Eleanor, had siblings herself or gazed at strangers with the same wondering eyes as I often did, sensing connections without evidence. I began journaling for the first time in decades, writing about not only my discovery, but the emotional terrain of adoption that so many viewers may never understand fully unless faced directly with their own origin stories, questioning how identity forms when both knowing and not knowing coexist comfortably until truths appear late and rearrange internal maps gently rather than violently. My children noticed my introspection too, asking softly why I seemed preoccupied, and I shared only what felt comfortable then, telling them I had stumbled onto parts of family history rooted deeper than expected, wanting to process it alone first without inviting confusion into their worlds prematurely because I was navigating delicate emotional waters best charted slowly, one quiet realization at a time. In moments of solitude, I'd reopen the letters carefully, reread extracts from Margaret's trembling script, describing how love often means stepping away so someone else can step forward, phrases that seemed hauntingly prophetic, because she truly had stepped away so I could step fully into my new family life without interruption, and each word humbled me with the understanding that maternal love can express itself through presence or absence equally depending on circumstance. I imagined Eleanor, too, her youth suspended within those photographs, wondering how life had unfolded around her after the separation, whether she found peace or remained burdened by secrecy.
And these musings stirred a compassion that replaced curiosity with sincere empathy, realizing my quest for answers was not simply personal, but a tribute to two women whose lives were irrevocably altered by the quiet decisions surrounding my birth. Evenings brought renewed reflection as I sat beneath porch lights listening to passing cars while the world seemed steadily unchanged despite my inner revelations, reminding me how personal awakenings rarely slow society's pace, yet profoundly reshape how individuals move through it afterward. And I slowly accepted that the next steps ahead didn't need urgency or investigation lists yet, just time. Time to emotionally integrate new truths alongside old loves without allowing either to eclipse the other. Above all, I clung to the knowledge that both realities, the family who raised me and the women who sacrificed silently, could coexist in honoring balance rather than conflict. Because identity need not be singular in origin to be whole in meaning. And maybe this unfolding journey wasn't about altering the past at all, but understanding it deeply enough to enrich the present. With each passing night, the box remained tucked safely beneath my bed again, no longer hidden forgotten debris, but a symbolic reminder that souls carry layered stories far beneath visible surfaces, and that sometimes the most profound journeys begin not with daring leaps forward, but with gentle steps inward, learning to hold truth tenderly until it is ready to guide us someplace new.
In the weeks that followed, I slowly allowed the discovery to weave into daily life, not as a dramatic turning point, but as a quiet companion to my evenings and mornings, shaping how I observed the ordinary details around me. And I began sharing gentle hints of the truth with my adult children as I felt steadier, sitting together at the dining table where milestones had once been celebrated, explaining that an old family box had opened new chapters of understanding about my origins, careful not to frame it as loss, but as added depths to a story already shaped by love. And their response surprised me with natural compassion instead of confusion. Their first questions not about bloodlines, but about how I felt, which reassured me that the values passed down through 3 generations had remained grounded where they belonged, in empathy rather than genealogy. As conversations unfolded, I realized how the fullness of human connection expands rather than divides when honesty is met with tenderness, because their acceptance strengthened my own sense of wholeness instead of fragmenting it, allowing curiosity to deepen without destabilizing emotional ground I had relied upon since childhood. Yet beneath these supportive exchanges lived a softer private transformation, an emotional reorientation that drew me inward more frequently than outward, as if my mind was quietly reorganizing stored memories and associations to accommodate Eleanor and Margaret as figures not merely in a discovered history, but within my emotional constellation of belonging. I began noticing fleeting patterns around me that echoed newly discovered threats, reflections in shop windows where my cheekbones mirrored the young woman's photograph, small mannerisms like touching my collar when nervous, gestures I wondered if they had lived long before me, and though I knew such musings were intuitive and not evidence, they offered comfort rather than confusion, providing emotional continuity where logic remained quiet. I found myself returning often to Margaret's handwritten words, especially lines expressing hope that the little girl would grow unburdened by the truths which required adult shoulders, because I realized that was exactly what my parents had achieved, shielding me not from truth forever but from knowing it too soon, when emotional comprehension had been too small for such weight, and now receiving that truth late in life felt like a final gift rather than a withheld knowledge. Memories resurfaced differently as this realization deepened, moments when my adoptive mother watched me with almost reverent intensity at piano recitals, when she cried quietly at graduations not from pride alone, but possibly from gratitude for the chance to nurture a life chosen as much as cherished, and recognizing this now elevated my gratitude into deeper reverence, because I understood how fully they had committed not simply to raising me, but to honoring the unseen women who entrusted me to their care without ever meeting them face to face. I also reflected on my own path into motherhood, how fiercely protective I became of my children, how instinctively I valued transparency between us even when conversations felt uncomfortable, perhaps unknowingly influenced by the silences that shaped my beginning, and how intentional I was in offering them space to ask difficult questions without fear, a parenting style I hadn't previously traced back to anything in particular yet now recognized as rooted in wanting to prevent gaps between love and truth. Quiet afternoons became spaces for mental exploration more than external action, as I considered whether I should pursue contact or maintain these revelations privately, weighing emotional readiness against personal curiosity. And though I toyed with the idea of DNA testing or archive searches, I felt no urgency yet, only a gentle leaning toward honoring reflection before investigation, trusting that answers would arrive when inner clarity set the pace. Meanwhile, the letters sat preserved beneath the bed along with the photographs, waiting patiently as silent witnesses rather than demands for movement. And I realized I didn't feel alone in the waiting because their presence itself symbolized connection even without voices or responses. Occasionally I imagined Eleanor or Margaret reflecting on their own lives decades later, wondering whether the child they relinquished lived well, found belonging, carried kindness forward, questions perhaps never answered for them but now echoed gently inside me, strengthening my gratitude for having lived a life that could proudly answer yes to each imagined inquiry. Somewhere along this introspective path, I felt a shift from simply wanting answers to wanting to honor the journey itself, the courage that placed me into loving arms, the secrecy that preserved safety over exposure, the maternal love expressed differently across women bound by circumstances rather than blood, and that understanding eased potential sorrow before it could take hold, nurturing compassion at the core of my reflections.
As seasons changed outside, leaves forming and falling through windows I'd watched them shift for countless years, I sensed how internal transformation often blends quietly into the ongoing rhythms of life rather than interrupting them, teaching us that profound truths need not scream to reshape our hearts but can whisper steadily until resistance dissolves into spacious acceptance. Evening walks through familiar streets felt subtly renewed, as if I carried unseen companions beside me now whose stories traveled silently along the sidewalks of memory, reminding me how interconnected all lives truly are even when paths never visually cross. And I began to approach strangers with gentler attentiveness, feeling kinship with human complexity in ways I hadn't consciously recognized before. Ultimately, I realized that this story unfolding wasn't anchored in uncovering names or genetic roads, as much as it was anchored in understanding the layer and nature of identity, how we exist both as children of nurture and carriers of unseen heritage, and how both sources contribute equally to individual strength without competing for emotional supremacy. By embracing this layered understanding, I felt deeper emotional equilibrium rather than fragmentation, accepting that personal origins need not be faced with drama or upheaval, but can become opportunities for quiet integration, moments where past mystery merges gently with present gratitude to shape a future grounded in peace. And as that acceptance settled deeper inside me, I felt prepared, though not rushed, for whatever next questions might arise later, because I understood now that truth, when welcomed with softness, becomes less about searching outward and more about listening inward, a rhythm of discovery that unfolds only as quickly as the heart allows.
The quiet balance I had found did not break all at once, but began to thin slowly, stretched by new questions I had not anticipated would grow louder with time. Because reflection, once awakened, often invites a deeper hunger for understanding. And what started as gentle curiosity soon became an emotional pressure, as I wondered not only about the women whose letters I now held dear, but about whether living with partial truth was still enough when the possibility of fuller connection existed just beyond reach. I found myself lingering late at the kitchen table, scrolling through genealogy forums, and reading the stories of others who pursued reunions across years of separation, noticing how some found joyful closure while others uncovered heartbreak of fragile silences, and these narratives conflicted within me as reassurance wrestled gently with caution, since I had grown accustomed to emotional steadiness and feared disrupting it with unpredictable outcomes. Still, one afternoon after weeks of quiet deliberation, my fingers hovered over a DNA testing website link longer than I would admit, heart beating softly but insistently, knowing the option was not about disloyalty to the parents who raised me, but about expanding my awareness of the fuller truths surrounding my origin. And eventually, curiosity tipped into courage as I ordered the kit not with urgency, but with respect, whispering to no one in particular that I would proceed slowly and with care. When the small box package arrived days later, unassuming and lightweight, it surprised me how much emotional gravity it seemed to carry, resting on the counter beside stacks of mail until I finally opened it with hands both steady and trembling, aware that the simple act of sealing a saliva vial had the potential to open doors whose consequences I could not predict, yet I reminded myself this was not about rushing toward reunion, but gently welcoming insight, wherever that pathway led. After mailing the sample, the waiting period stretched on like a long breath held between past and future, and during that time the letters became anchors rather than enigmas, comforting me with known history while unseen results hovered beyond thought's horizon. And my days resumed their routine pace, though I noticed moments of distraction, pauses at grocery lists, lingering gazes at passing stranger faces, where I wondered if I crossed paths unknowingly with hidden relatives, or shared mirrored gestures with people whose blood quietly aligned with mine. At family gatherings, the topic remained mostly unspoken, except in small check-ins from my children, who respected the delicate emotional space I navigated. And I reassured them truthfully that I felt calm, approachable to conversation, but unwilling to let anticipation overshadow present joy, because I feared attaching too much emotion to a process governed by algorithms and database probability rather than lived relationship. Yet privately, the weight continued to grow, not heavy like dread, but dense with expectancy, and I found nights lengthening into reflections where I replayed Eleanor's photograph in my mind, wondering if she had married, whether laughter had found her again after secrecy faded, whether she ever looked into crowds or mirror faces seeking me unknowingly, or if life had gently moved her forward beyond the pain of relinquishment's echo. The philosophical tug widened alongside the emotional one, because I grappled with how much our need for truth is driven not solely by desire for knowledge, but by longing for continuity, the human instinct to stitch our beginnings together so identity feels less scattered, and I wondered if discovering biological connections would strengthen that continuity or challenge its peace, since I already felt complete yet curious simultaneously. In quieter moments, I anticipated potential encounters and rehearsed dental dialogues, even though no names existed yet, imagining what I might say if the letter's authors or their descendants appeared before me in real voice rather than handwritten echoes, knowing I would begin with gratitude before questions, because love had framed every visible step of this narrative, even where social limitations forced silence. As the waiting period stretched into weeks, the tension subtly infiltrated dreams, presenting two young women watching from a distance while a child walked between worlds of belonging, unaware of her dual heritage. Imagery that never frightened me, but reminded me how layered emotional identities form quietly when origins remain partially veiled. My dreams often ended with me reaching toward figures whose faces remained indistinct, reinforcing a yearning not for reunion precisely, but for resolution, that gentle sense when unanswered internal questions finally settle into understanding, whether through answers or acceptance. At times, I chastised myself for risking disruption of peace late in life, reminding myself how many people live joyfully without pursuing genealogical clarity, but deeper reflection returned me to the notion that personal journeys need not justify themselves through necessity alone. Curiosity itself can be a form form of honoring past sacrifices rather than betraying present peace. Still, emotional ambiguity began casting subtle shadows over my mindfulness, showing up as hesitation when friends asked what occupied my thoughts, or as quite changes in appetite and sleep rhythms. Mild enough to remain unnoticed outwardly, but felt internally as emotional weather slowly shifting from calm toward introspective turbulence. I recognized that internal disruption didn't equate to chaos, but to movement, and movement simply meant emotional growth demanding space to expand. But even this reasoning did little to quiet the fluttering uncertainty I carried inside me each day as the results remained pending. One particularly reflective evening, I sat alone rereading Margaret's statement that the child they entrusted would someday understand that absence does not diminish love, it only reshapes its expression. And these words became both comfort and challenge, encouraging me to welcome all truths regardless of discomfort, because love's evolution depended upon honesty's courage rather than protective silence. That realization softened my hesitations, helping me reconcile the paradox of being both content and curious, not mutually exclusive states, but complementary ones. Yet fear lingered nonetheless, because potential discoveries threatened not my sense of belonging, which remained firm, but the emotional equilibrium I had cultivated so carefully across decades of stable identity. And so I lived suspended gently between longing and restraint, between reverent gratitude and awakening pursuit, understanding that something unnamed but undeniably powerful was stirring beneath my calm exterior, poised to draw me forward into emotional territory both unknown and transformative. Once the long-awaited email would finally arrive, bearing undiscovered connections that no longer existed only in paper shadows or late-night dreams.
The waiting finally reached its quiet conclusion on an otherwise ordinary morning when I opened my email to a simple notification that read, "Your DNA results are ready." And despite the neutral wording, my body reacted as though something vast had arrived unannounced. My breath catching as I stared at the screen longer than necessary, knowing that within a few clicks lived the possibility of answering questions decades in the making or introducing entirely new ones. And I sat at the kitchen table with the same chair I had occupied while reading the old letters, grounding myself before continuing, because I did not want to approach this moment with emotional recklessness, but measured reverence. When I finally logged in, the website loaded charts of ancestry percentages first, regions and ethnic lines that confirmed what I generally expected, yet confirmed little emotionally. But then appeared the match list, a scrolling column of names marked with relational predictions like second cousin, first cousin once removed, and finally a single highlighted connection classified as close family, likely sibling relationship. And in that instant, the room felt charged with inward electricity as I reread the line repeatedly to ensure my eyes weren't misinterpreting its meaning, sibling. My heart slowed rather than raced, strangely calmed by the clarity of confirmation, even as the emotional implications widened around me, because what had once been imagined now existed as statistical reality. I likely had a sister alive somewhere who shared blood memory unknown to us both until now. I clicked the profile initiated beneath the match name, studying a silhouette photo placeholder, brief biographical text stating hobbies like walking trails and watercolor painting, geographic locations several states away, age only reported in range, placing her slightly older than me, aligning seamlessly with Eleanor's chronology, and the subtle coherence of these details struck me as more intimate than coincidence, while still remaining painfully abstract without face or voice. For long moments, I avoided pressing the message button, aware that though the technology offered immediate connection, emotional readiness still needed time to catch breath after decades of unawareness, because initiating contact with probable kin requires not only curiosity, but care for both hearts involved, including the unseen one who might be just as unaware of this revelation as I had been before that forgotten box surfaced. I walked the length of the house to steady myself, deeply aware that this single click held power to alter narratives on both sides permanently, and returned to the table realizing movement inward rather than outward remained necessary before any digital gesture of outreach. I reread Margaret's letters to remind myself that love framed every unknown separation tied to this newfound relationship, that nobody intentionally buried truth but preserved safety the only way they could at that time, and grounding my spirit in compassion eased confusion growing around me as curiosity battled caution once more. I imagined the possible reactions the other woman might feel, shock, joy, skepticism, emotional dislocation, and recognize that reunion stories rarely unfold cleanly like emotional fairy tales, but rather involve navigating intertwined histories shaped by secrecy and circumstance rather than intent to deceive. And this sobering awareness anchored me away from impulsive communication. Instead of writing immediately, I saved the contact page and allowed myself to process inwardly first, understanding that discovery itself required emotional digestion before external response, because unprocessed wonder risks turning into emotional overwhelm when confronted too quickly.
Over subsequent days, I reviewed the match repeatedly, noticing small updates as more individuals connected to our shared lineage appeared, creating branching confirmation that strengthened the sibling likelihood, yet emotional distance between recognition and readiness remained intact. Because honoring relationship requires presence brought slowly to consciousness, not thrust recklessly into digital initiation. My children supported me quietly, urging nothing, simply holding space with listening hearts that eased me further into balance as I verbalized both excitement and apprehension without dramatization, knowing they accepted whatever pace I chose as the correct one for me. At night, I dreamed of two paths converging unexpectedly at a crossroads marked only by a quiet bench beneath tall trees, the figures seated upon it mirroring each other's posture oddly, hands clasped in uncertain stillness, as if waiting for courage rather than revelation to move first. Dreams that gently illustrated my emotional state more clearly than reason could articulate. Meanwhile, daily tasks continued as anchors, tending garden soil, folding laundry, cooking comfort meals, reminders that life's continuity provides emotional stability even as transformative truths swirl quietly beside it. Despite maintaining daily rhythms, the internal question persisted, not whether I had a sister because evidence indicated probability clearly, but whether relationship awaited our discovery or whether knowing alone fulfilled enough purpose for peace. I reflected deeply on meaning. Blood establishes biological connection, but not automatically emotional relationship. Relationship itself demands vulnerability, shared time, communication, patience, and consent on both parts, none of which can be assumed even when shared heritage exists. This understanding softened expectation, keeping hope present without making reunion outcome an emotional dependency for fulfillment, preventing disappointment from potential non-reciprocal response. And yet still the unanswered invitation lingered as a subtle internal ache, not painful but calling, echoing something basic in all of us, the longing to know our origin story's characters not only through documents, but voices, to glimpse ourselves mirrored literally rather than symbolically. One late evening after several weeks of reflection, I sat alone with the laptop, hands resting still on the keyboard, and typed a gentle introductory message in draft without sending it. Hello, I believe we may share family history, and I wanted to reach out with care, not urgency, just openness. Rereading these words repeatedly to assess their emotional sincerity before saving them privately again, not quite ready to cross the threshold because timing mattered deeply to me, and intuition whispered that patience remained my ally rather than delay representing fear. By acknowledging this boundary, I strengthened trust in myself rather than shame over hesitation, knowing that courage sometimes expresses itself not through speed but steadiness. In those quiet waiting weeks, I grew skilled at holding dual states, discovery and stillness, allowing emotional tension to exist without forcing resolution prematurely, recognizing that growth itself transpires in liminal spaces between question and answer, between longing and acceptance. As autumn deepened outside and evenings cooled noticeably, I sensed that a turning moment approached emotionally even if physically unmarked. A readiness stirring beneath caution, a gentle internal movement not towards impulsive action, but towards compassionate initiation, when correspondence might someday unfold not as emotional demand, but invitation to shared understanding unburdened by relegated past secrecy. Until that moment emerged fully, I rested with the unfolding truth rather than racing towards immediate outcome, trusting that life tended to arrive at connections organically when hearts align, not forced by discovery but drawn together through maturity of openness. And I accepted this delicate tension as the necessary threshold to something meaningful waiting beyond anticipation's horizon.
A turning point did not strike suddenly with dramatic confrontation or irreversible decision, but instead unfolded quietly one evening when my saved draft message stared back at me from the laptop screen, as if patiently waiting alongside my reflection in the dim room's glow. And in that stillness I felt a gentle internal shift replacing hesitation with acceptance, not acceptance of a specific outcome, but of the simple truth that honoring possibility mattered as much as protecting peace, because discovery withheld eventually becomes a weight heavier than discovery shared. I reread Margaret's final letter that night where she wrote about bravery not always meaning bold steps outward but honest steps inward, and this sentiment crystallized something essential I had not yet allowed myself to believe. Reaching out did not mean demanding reunion or emotional assurance. It meant extending respect toward connection wherever it naturally chose to settle. With trepidation softened by clarity, I returned to my drafted words and refined them carefully to reflect non-expectation rather than emotional urgency, adding that I did not seek immediate response or personal revelation, but simply wanted to open a gentle door of truth should curiosity rest on both sides, and with a steady breath I sent the message forward into the invisible digital space where it would land in another woman's unseen life carrying nothing but sincerity and quiet hope. Immediately afterward, an overwhelming stillness washed through me, not relief but emotional suspension, as if I had stepped off an unseen threshold and now stood waiting not for answers necessarily, but for the courage I already proved to have summoned.
Days passed again into waiting filled with familiar routines, yet now anticipation felt anchored rather than restless, because I had taken the step that uncertainty demanded without betraying peace or rushing expectation, trusting the universe to handle remaining pathways beyond my control. During this waiting period, I returned to memories of Margaret and Eleanor's correspondence with softened perspective, no longer only records of sorrowful separation, but examples of courageous truth-telling constrained by eras of silence. And I understood more deeply how the emotional landscape of relinquishment mirrored my own current vulnerability, reaching outward without knowing whether reciprocity existed yet choosing connection anyway, because hope outweighed fear. One afternoon while pruning roses outdoors, my phone vibrated softly, delivering a notification not from mail or reminders, but the very DMA platform where my message lived, and though hands still coated in dirt, heart surprisingly calm, I retrieved the phone and read 3 brief words that my sister, the woman whose face remained unknown, had written simply, "Yes, let's talk." Those words carried no dramatic flourish, no immediate emotional disclosure, yet within them lived a bridge strong enough to support decades of separation between parallel lives finally converging, and as tears welled without sobbing, I recognized how powerful understated responses can be when they echo emotional readiness. Our first exchanges unfolded cautiously but warmly, with measured sentences introducing ourselves not as familial titles, but as 2 women navigating sudden relational proximity, sharing surface-level information where we lived, our children, our daily interests, rather than diving into emotional confessions immediately, respecting the fragility of the space we entered. And even so I felt emotional resonance nestled beneath these neutral exchanges, a sense of familiarity without recognition that surprised my spirit more than logic could justify. She described being adopted as an infant too, raised in a loving household unaware that any siblings existed, having always felt a faint sense of incompleteness she could not name until receiving her DNA notification, which mirrored my own stirrings of curiosity, and hearing how similar our emotional experiences became despite geographical separation, strengthened the authenticity of our connection beyond genetic validation alone. Over subsequent days, communication developed organically. Messages longer, emotions surfacing gently rather than explosively, as we shared learning that our births were separated by only 11 months, siblings indeed, born to Eleanor and Margaret during the brief overlapping window of their shared years. A revelation that stunned me with both awe and sorrow as I contemplated how these women endured double sacrifice, relinquishing not 1 but 2 daughters so we could grow into safe, loved environments beyond social condemnation of their era. This realization deepened not grief but reverence, honoring how unimaginable courage intersected with heartbreaking necessity to shape the lives we now celebrated. 2 grown women unknowingly living parallel stories rooted in identical origin narratives that only time had kept apart. In our conversations, we did not dwell long on tragedy but focused instinctively on gratitude, both of us expressing deep appreciation for our adoptive families, recognizing how emotional abundance across 2 households had arisen from painful decisions made long ago, and that perspective prevented our reunion from becoming a lamentation, but instead transformed it into gratitude-filled discovery without resentment coloring the edges. Weeks progressed towards our decision to engage in live phone conversation after much careful anticipation, the first chance to hear voices shaped by shared genetics, yet molded by entirely separate life experiences. And when I heard her greeting fill my ear, something within me clicked unmistakably, not dramatic completion but subtle alignment, as though familiar cadence gently surfaced from somewhere latent in me, confirmation not born of science but sensation. Our conversation flowed haltingly at first, marked by nervous laughter, overlapping questions, pauses filled with emotion neither of us rushed to articulate, gradually easing into free laughter as discomfort melted into natural connection. And in that moment I recognized that relationship does not demand long shared history to flourish when authenticity guides initial exchanges. Sincerity forms bridges swiftly when both parties honor vulnerability respectfully. After ending the call, I sat quietly reflecting how the deepest transformations often arrive not with thunderous revelation, but simple exchanges that reshape inner landscapes permanently, altering perspectives about identity, solitude, and connection with understated permanence. The turning point had arrived without spectacle, yet shifted my emotional axis undeniably. The search for understanding matured into lived connection, underscoring how honoring curiosity through gentle courage had drawn me across unknown thresholds into emotional territory not unlike family recognition, though still unfolding patiently rather than instantaneously. As I gazed at the fading sunlight spilling onto the wooden floor later that evening, I whispered another thank you, this time directed not only towards the past but also to myself for choosing bravery shaped by kindness, realizing that sometimes life waits patiently across years of silence only until hearts grow steady enough to meet truth with graceful acceptance.
That first conversation with my sister, a new emotional rhythm gently settled into my days, not disruptive, not overwhelming, but reverent, as if an internal clock long missing its final component had quietly realigned instead of loudly chiming, and I found myself reflecting constantly on how 2 lives shaped independently by love could still echo one another without shared memories, linked not only through DNA but through deeper emotional cadence. Our calls increased naturally over time, neither of us forcing frequency but responding organically to curiosity and comfort, and gradually our conversations expanded beyond surface details into more honest exchanges, little childhood stories, personal fears, parenting reflections, shared quirks we recognized astonishingly mirrored each other, like both of us organizing kitchen cabinets similarly or speaking thoughtfully with long pauses before answering difficult questions, behaviors neither had learned from the other yet both expressed instinctively, which quietly affirmed the reality of our connection more than any laboratory percentage ever could.
We spoke cautiously about Eleanor and Margaret, only as we felt emotionally able, piecing together insights from letters on my side and fragmented recollections preserved in sealed adoption documents on hers, and together we reconstructed glimpses of their partnership, their youth bound by secrecy and love limited by social boundaries. Yet rather than allowing sorrow to dominate these revelations, we shared gratitude for their sacrifices, acknowledging that we stood now as living proof that compassion extended outward, even when constrained by fear, can set goodness in motion decades later. Eventually, curiosity matured into mutual readiness to see each other face to face, not as strangers chasing expectations, but as two women meeting in the present, grounded by maturity rather than longing. And after careful discussion, we arranged to meet midway in a quiet lakeside town neither had visited before, a neutral place free of emotional ties, allowing us to approach the encounter without pressure to perform roles prematurely. On the morning of our meeting, nerves danced within me, yet were accompanied by an unusual calm, breathing steady as I dressed with the thoughtful composure one might carry before greeting an old friend rather than confronting unknown destiny, recognizing that emotional authenticity often blossoms when anticipation dissolves into present awareness. I arrived early at the small lakeside cafe and chose a table near the window overlooking drifting water reeds, hands wrapped around a teacup, not from cold but grounding habit, and waited as minutes passed in gentle stillness until I noticed a woman approaching the entrance whose posture mirrored my own slightly forward lean when uncertain, and in that instant a recognition surfaced, independent of logic, a magnetic familiarity without knowing her face, and when she stepped inside and scanned the room, eyes meeting mine, the silent acknowledgement between us arrived fully formed without words. We stood simultaneously and moved toward each other slowly, without awkward urgency, offering a gentle shared smile before embracing softly, not dramatic or tear-laden, but weighted with quiet emotion. And that brief contact extinguished any lingering uncertainty regarding how we might feel in each other's presence. The warmth was natural, as if emotion had simply waited years to resume recognition. Conversation over coffee flowed surprisingly easily, our voices finding matching cadence, laughter rising unexpectedly during minor story sharing about mismatched shoes or parenting mishaps, acquiring comic resonance as our mirrored humor became evident, and moments of reflection grew tender whenever Eleanor or Margaret emerged within dialogue, acknowledging the origins connecting us without allowing historic sorrow to eclipse present joy. I noticed how observing her facial expressions felt like viewing slightly altered versions of my own expressions, familiar but refracted, and this visual kinship evoked both marvel and serenity rather than emotional disorientation, because identity proved strong enough to welcome rooted connection without fear of losing individuality. Over the hours together, we spoke deeply of adoption experiences, discovering shared emotional themes despite different households, gratitude layered with subtle curiosity, belonging anchored in love rather than lineage, and an innate attunement to empathy shaped not by origin narratives but parental nurture our adoptive families had invested wholeheartedly into our lives. We discussed whether to pursue greater documentation discovery together or allow the existing mosaic of understanding to remain gently incomplete, each agreeing that clarity itself holds varying degrees of necessity depending on emotional readiness and evolving goals, acknowledging neither of us needed exhaustive historical accounts to validate sibling bond already present. By afternoon's end, we walked quietly alongside the lake, speaking of future visits not as obligations but as possibilities, savoring organic companionship rather than planning aggressively for emotional acceleration, understanding that genuine relationship cultivation unfolds slowly, like gardens that bloom when tended patiently. As we parted before departing separate roads, our embrace felt less tentative than earlier, carrying comfort shaped through hours of shared presence rather than years of shared memory. And during the solitary drive home afterward, I reflected on how the turning point had not resided within discovering her existence alone, but within meeting her as the person she had become, authentic, compassionate, ordinary yet extraordinary, and recognizing how relationship now took precedence over inquiry. Later that evening at home, I returned to Margaret's letters once more, reading final passages of longing softened by hope, and for the first time I realized their story no longer remained suspended unfinished, not because reunion rewrote painful chapters, but because the courage exercised by all involved across generations had culminated now into present peace rather than unresolved yearning. I felt gratitude expand outward, toward Eleanor and Margaret for their imaginable strength, toward my adoptive parents for their unwavering devotion, toward my sister for embracing vulnerability, and perhaps even deeper toward myself for choosing openness over guarded caution, because this emotional turning point reshaped my understanding of legacy itself, that family flourishes not through possession of blood, but through deliberate acts of love carried forward across lives. When I lay down to sleep that night, inner stillness settled warmly, not an end-of-story calm, but the gentle readiness for a new chapter shaped by ongoing connection, knowing transformation had crossed its threshold not through yearning alone, but through brave engagement, and that emotional completeness truly emerges when identities expand to receive new bonds without diminishing existing ones, for the heart proves infinitely capable of holding multiple origins of love peacefully together. Our first in-person meeting settled into a new rhythm, quieter yet fuller, as if the emotional turbulence of anticipation had been gently replaced by a grounded awareness that connection does not always demand drama to feel profound. And in this space, I discovered that living with awareness of both past secrecy and present reunion could exist comfortably without conflict, allowing me to savor the unfolding bond with my sister while maintaining the life I had always known. Our conversations evolved naturally, moving from recounting childhood curiosities to sharing adult challenges and joys. Subtle gestures like how we both brew tea in the same careful manner, how we hesitate before offering advice, or how laughter bubbles unexpectedly when recounting minor embarrassments, which brought an almost uncanny sense of familiarity, as if genetic memory quietly influenced mannerisms despite decades apart. I began documenting our shared reflections privately, noting similarities in temperament, preferences, and subtle reactions, understanding that while we had separate histories shaped by different environments, a thread of innate connection ran quietly beneath surface differences, shaping emotional resonance in ways that felt both comforting and humbling. Family dynamics within my household shifted too, positively, as my children responded to the knowledge that I had a sister not with anxiety but with curiosity and acceptance, engaging in lighthearted questions and gentle inquiries, their own empathy and excitement reminding me how openness cultivates understanding across generations, extending beyond immediate reunion to impact broader relational circles. Occasionally, I revisited Eleanor and Margaret's letters, now viewed through a lens shaped not by sorrow, but by gratitude and reverence, appreciating the courage they had exercised and the foresight they displayed in safeguarding our emotional well-being while managing societal pressures of their time. And I realized that honoring their choices contributed directly to the peace I felt in reconciling past absence with present presence. My sister and I began to exchange small tokens, postcards, photographs, handwritten notes, initially simple, yet each carrying an emotional significance that deepened our bond without overwhelming either of us, demonstrating that care can manifest in modest acts as effectively as in grand gestures, reinforcing mutual respect and patience. Weekends became opportunities to coordinate phone or video calls, which at first felt tentative, but gradually blossomed into comfortable routines. We discussed hobbies, shared favorite recipes, and slowly recounted childhood memories with gentle curiosity rather than judgment, recognizing that these stories, though parallel, provided a foundation for emotional alignment rather than competition. The presence of her in my emotional landscape did not diminish existing relationships, but rather enriched them, offering a new dimension of understanding about myself and about the ways life unfolds unpredictably yet meaningfully, teaching me that openness to discovery strengthens rather than fractures familial ties. At times, I reflected on the peculiar intersection of technology and destiny, how a simple DNA kit catalyzed decades of unacknowledged kinship into tangible relationship, and marveled at the patience required to navigate both internal readiness and external connection simultaneously, recognizing that the medium mattered little compared to the emotional responsibility exercised in approaching it thoughtfully. I also observed subtle changes within myself, a softening of habitual caution, an increased willingness to embrace vulnerability, and a deeper appreciation for emotional honesty, realizing that these shifts were gifts not only from the reunion itself, but from the deliberate, patient pacing we both honored, allowing connection to unfold organically rather than under pressure. As our correspondence became consistent, my sister and I began planning a shared visit to her home, small and measured, understanding that physical presence would introduce new dimensions of relationship that required care and attentiveness. Yet the anticipation carried warmth rather than anxiety, reflecting the strength of the trust we had cultivated digitally and in person prior to this step. Throughout this time, I returned frequently to self-reflection, journaling about the interplay between adopted upbringing and biological roots, exploring how both forces had shaped personality, resilience, and emotional patterns, and recognizing that understanding oneself fully requires integrating experiences both seen and hidden, chosen and inherited. Slowly, I felt a sense of resolution settle over the years of quiet longing, a realization that knowing my sister and cultivating that bond did not negate the life I had lived, the love I had received, or the family that had nurtured me, but rather layered meaning upon my existence, deepening my understanding of love's expansive capacity and the human heart's ability to accommodate complex histories without fracturing. In quieter moments, I could sit and reflect on the old letters and photographs, feeling a peaceful acknowledgement that what had been withheld for decades had been transformed into something profoundly beautiful, a living connection that honored both past sacrifices and present courage, a gentle reconciliation of absence with presence, and a reminder that life's timing, though often mysterious, unfolds with a grace that patience and empathy can recognize. Even simple daily routines, making tea, reading by the window, walking through familiar streets, carried newfound depth, as I considered how one life could intersect unexpectedly with another, quietly teaching lessons about patience, gratitude, and the subtle power of discovery. This resolution was not a dramatic closure, but a calm ongoing process of weaving together threads previously separated, recognizing that the emotional landscape of reunion is not a single event, but a tapestry of many small moments, reflections, and gentle gestures that collectively define the depth and authenticity of connection. I felt more attuned to the value of careful listening, the importance of pacing, and the transformative potential of empathy in relationships, understanding that meaningful bonds require both space and attention, and that the heart often knows how to navigate vulnerability when guided by patience and love. By embracing the ongoing nature of these connections, I discovered a serenity that had been absent in earlier decades, a sense of emotional completeness that acknowledged both the complexity of life's past and the hopefulness of its unfolding present. Each message exchanged, each conversation held, and each moment shared with my sister became a small affirmation of the power of human courage and emotional honesty, reminding me that the paths we take, sometimes unknown, sometimes delayed, can culminate in profound joy when approached with care, respect, and patience, and that the journey itself, not just the discovery, shapes the heart in enduring ways.
As weeks turned into months, the bond with my sister continued to deepen organically, each interaction revealing nuances of personality, humor, and shared sensibilities that astonished me with their subtle alignment, reminding me that nature often leaves traces we cannot see but instinctively recognize. And I felt gratitude not only for her presence but also for the patience and care that had guided both of us into readiness to meet fully. Our conversations grew more candid, exploring personal triumphs and disappointments, moments of vulnerability we had long withheld from the world. Yet instead of overwhelming, these admissions fostered understanding and empathy, each revelation forming an invisible thread linking our experiences across time and distance. Family gatherings shifted too. My children and hers became curious about their newfound extended relative, and together we created playful, gentle interactions that honored our individuality while nurturing shared connection, demonstrating to all of us the healing and enriching power of openness and acceptance. I frequently revisited Eleanor and Margaret's letters, now not as records of sorrow or secrecy, but as testimonies of courage, resilience, and love that had endured despite societal limitations, and I realized their sacrifices had allowed us to grow independently yet reconnect meaningfully, an enduring gift that shaped our adult selves profoundly. Small gestures became meaningful markers of closeness, handwritten notes, photos, recipes exchanged, calls that evolved into laughter-filled storytelling, and the unspoken understanding that even when apart, our connection remained constant, resilient, and patient, teaching me that relationships do not always require immediacy, but thrive through consistent care and mutual respect. Emotional growth accompanied this connection as I noticed myself embracing vulnerability with less hesitation, valuing emotional honesty over guarded restraint, and accepting that love extends in multiple directions simultaneously toward adoptive families, biological family, and newly discovered relationships without diminishing any. I reflected on how technology, timing, and human courage had intersected, facilitating a reunion that felt natural, grounded, and profoundly human, and I understood that the significance of this turning point lay not merely in discovering a sibling, but in recognizing the depth of trust, empathy, and patience required to cultivate a bond worth sustaining. Visits became part of our evolving relationship, simple trips designed for comfort and mutual ease rather than grand gestures, yet each meeting reinforced our bond, providing context to shared traits and emotional resonance, and allowing us to experience firsthand the subtle ways in which years of separation had shaped us differently yet connected us inherently. I also reflected inwardly on how this journey reshaped my sense of self, revealing that identity is both inherited and cultivated, formed by adoption, life experience, and the rediscovery of family, and that integrating these elements with awareness and grace can transform uncertainty into peace and absence into understanding. Through all of this, I carried quiet reverence for the emotional labor required to navigate such connections, acknowledging the bravery in both seeking and welcoming reunion without expectation, and the serenity that arises when human curiosity is balanced with empathy and respect. Even ordinary moments, preparing meals, reading, walking through familiar streets, now carried subtle emotional resonance, enriched by awareness of a living, breathing sibling navigating her life alongside mine, sharing laughter, insights, and understanding, without pressure but with gentle consistency. Looking back, I could see how patience, courage, and thoughtful action had woven together a tapestry of reconciliation and joy, teaching lessons about the enduring power of human connection, the beauty of shared history rediscovered, and the profound satisfaction of nurturing relationships deliberately rather than impulsively. Ultimately, resolution was not a single event, but an ongoing process, a continuous unfolding of mutual respect, curiosity, and love that transformed what was once unknown into a living, dynamic bond, reminding me that even delayed discoveries can bear the most meaningful fruit, and that life's quiet, persistent gifts often arrive when hearts are ready to receive them fully. Through this process, I learned that reconciliation and reunion do not erase the past, but integrate it,
that understanding and empathy create bridges across time and distance, and that embracing vulnerability opens doors to joy that might otherwise remain closed, leaving me with a profound sense of peace, gratitude, and enduring connection that shape the remaining chapters of my life.
As the days gently flowed into months and years, I came to understand that life's most profound lessons often arrive quietly, without fanfare or dramatic revelation, and the reunion with my sister became a living reminder that patience, courage, and openness cultivate bonds that endure beyond circumstance. Our relationship settled into a natural rhythm: phone calls, messages, shared stories, each interaction reinforcing trust, understanding, and a subtle but undeniable warmth that grew with time. I noticed myself laughing more freely, feeling an expansive sense of belonging that encompassed both my adoptive family and this newfound connection, recognizing that love does not divide but multiplies when we welcome it without expectation. The lessons learned from Eleanor and Margaret's sacrifices, our separate upbringings, and the patient steps we each took to nurture this connection became deeply personal touchstones: gratitude, compassion, empathy, and the quiet courage to reach across unknowns with honesty. I reflected on how technology had bridged decades of separation, yet it was human patience and emotional readiness that transformed discovery into meaningful relationship, proving that tools alone do not create connection, hearts and intention do. Simple moments held extraordinary significance: sharing a favorite meal over video, recounting childhood memories, exchanging handwritten notes, or even noticing the subtle similarities in our gestures and expressions that betrayed our shared heritage, each moment weaving layers of understanding and trust. I realized that reunion is not a single climactic event, but an ongoing practice of presence, attention, and gentle curiosity, and that the true turning point is not discovery itself, but the willingness to cultivate relationship with integrity, care, and respect for both parties' pace. Emotional reflection became a daily companion. Sitting quietly by the window, sipping tea, or walking the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I felt a sense of fullness that had been absent before, not because all answers were known, but because connection existed in the most authentic form: tender, patient, and alive. Through this ongoing journey, I also recognized a subtle truth: that family is not only defined by biology, but by the deliberate acts of love, understanding, and commitment that individuals extend toward one another, and that creating these bonds intentionally is one of life's most meaningful achievements. I embraced this truth gently, feeling gratitude for the lives of those who had gone before us, whose choices enabled us to exist and connect, and for the courage I and my sister had exercised to meet each other authentically despite years of separation. Reflection became a source of quiet joy as I observed the interweaving of past and present, the blending of absence and presence, and the creation of new memories that honored both lineage and lived experience, understanding that life's richness comes not from perfection, but from attentive, compassionate engagement with one another. The presence of my sister taught me about the resilience of human connection, the subtle power of empathy, and the importance of embracing vulnerability as a strength rather than a risk. And these insights quietly reshaped my relationships with all those I loved, infusing interactions with deeper patience, attentiveness, and warmth. Even moments of solitude held a new resonance. Sitting in silence no longer felt empty, but reflective, allowing space to honor both the journey and the people who made it possible. And I learned that peace is not the absence of complexity, but the embrace of it with grace and understanding. In these gentle reflections, I found not closure in the conventional sense, but a profound sense of ongoing fulfillment, recognizing that life's most meaningful chapters are rarely abrupt or dramatic, but evolve through sustained attention, care, and intentional emotional presence. And as I looked forward, I understood that the bond with my sister, while rooted in discovery, would continue to deepen through shared experiences, mutual understanding, and the patient nurturing of trust, teaching me that love, in its truest form, is an enduring practice rather than a finite achievement, and that this practice enriches life in ways immeasurable, subtle, and lasting. In the quiet that followed the first months of reconnection, I came to understand that the true gift of this journey was not simply discovering a sister I never knew existed, but learning how patience, empathy, and vulnerability can transform lives in ways that linger long after the initial revelation. Our bond strengthened steadily, shaped by laughter, gentle conversations, shared reflections, and even the occasional disagreements that reminded us we were separate individuals navigating a shared history, proving that authentic connection embraces both similarity and difference with grace. I found myself revisiting old memories, letters, photographs, artifacts from the past with a sense of reverence and completeness, recognizing how each choice, each act of love, and even each absence had shaped the women we had become. There was a soft joy in knowing that the missing piece I had unknowingly sought for decades was now present, not as a replacement or answer to old questions, but as a companion in life's unfolding story, offering perspective, understanding, and mutual care. Daily routines, once familiar and comforting, now carried an added richness: a shared phone call in the morning, a message with a photo, a plan for a future visit, all reminding me that life's small gestures often hold the greatest emotional weight, shaping connection more effectively than grand decorations ever could. I reflected on the courage required to embrace uncertainty and reach beyond comfort zones, acknowledging that growth and fulfillment often demand more emotional patience than excitement, and that the most transformative moments are those we approach thoughtfully, without pressure or haste.
As the seasons passed, I noticed subtle changes in myself, greater openness, deeper empathy, a stronger sense of identity shaped not only by my own life experiences, but also by the recognition of shared heritage and the ongoing cultivation of familial bonds. Our story, once dormant, waiting silently in a 1930s storage box and years of unspoken history, had become a living narrative, evolving day by day, enriched by intentional effort, kindness, and the willingness to meet uncertainty with grace. I realized that connection is never a singular event, but a continuous process, one that requires dedication, presence, and the courage to remain emotionally available even when outcomes are unknown, and that such connections, once nurtured, yield enduring fulfillment far beyond initial discovery. Ultimately, the lesson I carry forward is both simple and profound. Life's most meaningful relationships are built on patience, honesty, and compassion, and embracing vulnerability is not weakness, but the doorway to authentic joy and belonging. I hold gratitude for those who came before us, Eleanor and Margaret, whose choices made this possible, for my adoptive family who nurtured and guided me with unwavering love, and for my sister who met me with openness and courage. And through this gratitude, I find peace, knowing that life's mysteries, though sometimes delayed, can yield extraordinary beauty when hearts are ready to receive it. In the quiet moments of reflection, I understand that our story is still unfolding, that each new memory, conversation, and shared laugh continues to weave a tapestry of love, resilience, and understanding, and that the true gift is not only in discovering one another, but in the conscious, deliberate act of nurturing that discovery into a lasting, meaningful relationship. And as I sit by the window, watching the sunlight play across familiar surroundings, I carry the gentle certainty that love, patience, and human courage have the power to transform lives, mend hidden gaps, and illuminate paths that for decades lay quietly in shadow, a truth both timeless and deeply personal, shaping not only the bond with my sister, but the way I move through the world with empathy, openness, and enduring hope.